During my more than 30 years of working at a community college, I've seen firsthand the dramatic increase in students on the autism spectrum pursuing degrees and certificate in higher education. I've spent most of my career providing support, accommodations, and assisting students in making the transition from high school to college. This work has included collaborating with college faculty and administrators to provide strategies, approaches, and best practices to support students in their transition and completion of post-secondary education. Hello, my name is Susan Woods, one of the Stairway to STEM editorial board members, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Autism in the Classroom, Making Education Accessible, presented with support from the National Science Foundation. Our focus today will be on engaging educators and practitioners in a discussion of evidence-based practices to support students on the autism spectrum pursuing STEM careers and higher education. I'm delighted to welcome our panel of experts for this conversation today. With us is Kristen Bailing, Associate Dean of Accessibility and Academic Resources in the Starr Center at Tufts University, and an adjunct professor in the Disability Services in Higher Education Graduate Certificate at Suffolk University. Margaret Bleichman, a faculty member at Middlesex Community College, teaching computer science, a longtime computer science department chair at Middlesex. Dr. Madhu Dar is an associate professor of physics and astronomy at Middlesex Community College and advisor to the college's STEM club. Dr. Eric Enlich, founder of Top College Consultants, which helps neurodivergent students apply to college. Dr. Enlich is a clinical psychologist and co-author of a new book on autistic adults. And Peter Shea, Director of Professional Instructional Development at Middlesex Community College and an adjunct faculty in the English department. Welcome. Opening question I'm going to give to Eric. Can you start us off by talking about some areas that students on the autism spectrum might find to be challenging in the college environment?
Sure, good question. Well, it's really all the same areas of challenge that they're experiencing in high school, plus some additional ones. In particular, in the areas of executive functioning and independent living skills. So if students are moving away from home to go to college, which is not always the case if they're in a community college, but if they are, then they have the additional challenges of living with a roommate and having to do their own laundry and get themselves to meals and manage various aspects of the college campus. But one of the most striking differences and challenges for a lot of these students is, again, in executive functioning, that is planning and organizing, managing their time, because in high school, there are a lot of supports that students may not even be conscious are there. Frequently, their parents are sort of a backstop, teachers, special ed staff, and others at school, perhaps private tutors and coaches. And then in college, there's much more need for the student to self-advocate, to be responsible for their time, to think about how they're going to spend their free time, because they have a lot more time that's unstructured compared to high school, and they have to stay on track with their assignments. And for some students who've been used to getting a lot of reminders from adults, they can easily fall behind if they don't either work on those skills before college or get additional supports in college.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn to two of our faculty in the STEM area. Madhu, in your role, you may have a different perspective. Have you observed any challenges in your teaching experience for students that you've come to know as being on the autism spectrum?
Right, I have had experiences with the students having this disability, but often faculty are not aware of it, but what kind of disability it is. So I look at this, that there is very less awareness in the college campuses. Faculty are not informed that there is this particular disability. So we are not aware all the time. My question is that when they enroll students, why aren't the professors informed that this particular student has this kind of problem? You may have to engage the classroom differently, or you may want to adjust your lab work, group work, or individual meetings with them accordingly. So, these are the things that I want should be rectified.
Right.
There should be a system where the Disability Services Office, the registrar, and the faculty should have a common, some common connection. Like a trigger should be sent out. This student is enrolled in your class a week or two prior, so that I can have some icebreaker activities for them. I can include equitable language in my syllabus if there is need for that.
Well, that's wonderful feedback. I'm gonna interject here that we could have a long conversation about why that doesn't happen. And I know that certainly Kirsten and a few other folks in the room could probably comment on that as well. But much of it is centered around the fact that the student has rights and is protected, and it's really up to the student to initiate that conversation, different than in a K through 12 world. That being said, I'm going to turn to Margie, and what do you think about one, the challenges you've seen, as well as Madhu's comment?
I'm going to dovetail a little bit with what Eric has said, and I'll try to address what Madhu said a little bit. I was going to say that the students that I have met that are on the autism spectrum actually have some of the same challenges as other students first coming to campus, but these challenges are magnified and they need more support. So first week of class, everybody's trying to find classrooms. I think students that are on the autism spectrum are having a harder time, and having somebody on the hall that is welcoming and just reaching out to every student actually covers the students who need that extra support as well as the other students. And it's not just physically, it's also the new expectations and the new expected behaviors. Inside a classroom, in my classroom, if you need to leave the classroom for a bio break, you leave the classroom, you come back with as little fanfare as possible, and students may still be used to having to ask permission. So there's this adjustment that I think that the other students may get much faster, like they get those cues, and the students, some students are not, and they're still, even in the second week of class, still, saying, well, this is what I used to do. So there's change. There's a lot of change. In terms of really the conceptual work, there's still, I think there's more nuance in what the expectations are, and less literalness. Although in my classroom, I try to be as literal as possible, again, for all of the students, because I think everybody benefits from it. I have more to say about this later.
And we'll definitely come back to that, because there's a theme that's emerging here for sure. So I'm going to tap you, Peter, as you have the advantage of seeing the college community, both as an administrator and as a faculty, as well as your work with the ND gifts. Do you have any thoughts on the challenges that students on the autism spectrum may encounter?
Yes, definitely. I think we've done a very good job over the years of creating a series of train tracks for students on the spectrum. The problem is the work is incomplete and there are gaps in the tracks. So the tracks get them further than they would have 10 years ago, but then there's a point where they stop and they have to find their way to the next series of tracks. And so some of the problems we're hearing about here are exactly those gaps. We're doing a much better job than we used to, but we're not doing nearly as good a job as we can do. So I think a lot of our work is to identify those points, identify the ones that are actionable at the present time, and try to create that bridge area. I think that's a really big part of the issue. I mean, I'm very encouraged about the changes that I've seen over the past couple of years, both as an administrator and as a parent. And I'm fortunate that I work at a community college, which historically has been one of the most welcoming places for students on the spectrum. But I still think there's an enormous amount we can do. I think one of our challenges is, it's paradoxical, we're living in a moment when there is a greater appreciation of the diversity of human beings than ever before, at least in my memory. And there's a greater drive to make everyone feel equally included, which are a tremendous inspiration. The problem, I think, as we all know, is that the model of diversity and inclusion that many places have do not include the neurodiverse. We are like the terra incognita of the diversity map. And so I think one of the things I'm hoping to see going forward is that we're able to expand people's awareness of diversity around neurodiverse people so that we can get the resources to address some of the issues that we've talked about here.
Absolutely. So this is a wonderful segue, because from the unique perspective of many of our panelists who are involved with professional development to support students, I believe all would agree that there's been increased awareness and progress made. But we're also interested in your thoughts about what more needs to happen and some best practices. So I'm actually going to turn to Kirsten, who's done a lot of this work, and ask you, what have you found to be key areas that the college community, and you're coming from a university, should consider when supporting and educating students on the autism spectrum, particularly those that are pursuing STEM careers?
It's a great question, Susan. I think that there's a number of ways that we can sort of look at this. There's sort of the academic and the non-academic side of the house, which for a lot of our students, the non-academic side of the house could be a newer area for many of them to experience, whereas the academic side, there's some familiarity with how, you know, to approach a course. Although I agree with Professor Bleichman that, you know, it may not be as literal, maybe more as an applied adjustment to the academics, which is something that any student needs to learn when they attend college, and is usually what those first year courses are about. I think from a faculty and staff perspective, I am a huge proponent of universal design. I think that COVID has done us, if anything positive has come out of COVID, I think we have learned to appreciate the diversity of our learners, their educational background, their experiences coming into this strange new world that we're in, and also the diversity of the environment that they may be in. And I think that that goes two sides in terms of faculty too, right? We've had to make huge adjustments as instructors in terms of how we teach. And I hope that that broadened horizon will help faculty, and I've seen it in some research that we're doing, plan to continue to increase the flexibility of their classrooms and how students engage with the course, the way that they are instructed, the way that they're assessed. So I think that there's a lot that can continue on that sort of perspective of increased flexibility in all college classes that faculty are accidentally doing as a result of COVID, which is excellent. We love that.
Yeah, I'm going to ask Eric, because we've had this discussion, he and I, before. Can you identify any key areas that you think college and universities should focus on? You know, tapping into the universal design, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail in a moment, but also how to create a welcoming environment to students on the autism spectrum. What can be done systemically, and what should the administration be focused on?
Well, it's such an important question, and it's a really big question. And, you know, going back to Kirsten's focus on universal design, I think the gold standard, to me, sort of the ultimate goal would be to have colleges be inclusive of everyone, obviously including neurodiversity, essentially be autism-friendly colleges in the big picture, not just autism support programs and services. There's a charity in Ireland called As I Am that's sort of at the forefront of this by helping colleges become autism friendly across the board, not just developing an autism support program. But there are a number of colleges, as I list on my website, that have dedicated autism support programs. They're great. One of the challenges is getting students comfortable stepping forward and disclosing that they're on the spectrum in the first place. And this, of course, can come up with any disability or any diagnosis, medical or otherwise. And in order for students to feel comfortable, they need to feel welcome. They need to feel like, hey, if I come forward, I'm not going to be stigmatized or discriminated against. And that, I think, comes about through faculty training, university-wide, college-wide training for staff, faculty, and students. Sending the message across the board from, you know, the time that people go to the website or look at admissions materials, that this college isn't just recruiting men and women, it's not just recruiting white students and students of color, but it's recruiting neurodiverse students.
Thank you.
So I think sending that message across the board is key.
Very important. And so I'm going to turn to our esteemed faculty, because your approach and strategies are so very important. You're really the front line to promote access. So I'm going to start first with Madhu. Are there specific strategies and approaches that you found to be successful to support students? And again, it's not just students on the autism spectrum, it's all your students. But has there been anything that's been particularly effective?
I think I can give the two scenarios, one is pre-COVID and one is during COVID. So before COVID, like we would give extended time. These are the normal things that we do, note takers, technology help. But I feel that talking to the professor, creating time and talking one-on-one with the student, because there aren't too many students in the class in a particular section. So if the professor is flexible, they can just create some time and make them feel at ease. That's the first thing they can do. If there are 24 students and out of it you have 2 under spectrum, so it's easy to create one-on-one time with them. And also I think the campus should create increased autism or ADHD or any mental health problems. Awareness should be increased.
Margie, any approaches that you find that best increase the access to curriculum for students on the spectrum or students that may, be neurodiverse or learn differently?
Yes, thank you. I think that all of the strategies that I'm about to speak about, with a couple of exceptions, I think they really help every student in the classroom. And also, there are students in every classroom that may not be specifically diagnosed or may not be specifically, where is everybody on this spectrum anyway? So I just wanted to say that there are students that benefit from a lot of these methodologies. There has been, I'll focus on some specific things, but then a general. Sometimes students take a long time to answer a question. And I think it's every teacher's challenge to have patience. And we know that when we ask a question, there's a pause and, no student wants to sort of go in the fray. But on the other end, there's sometimes a student that is extra eager to answer every single question you ask, plus some more. And that is really something that you have to figure out early on. And it tends to, after the first week, maybe it tends to sort of die down a little bit, but at least at the beginning to allow that extra time and to model that, because we're in such a fast culture that we want to get to that answer right away. But the students are really getting to some very thoughtful answers. It's just taking them longer. However, sometimes it's too long. And I have long classrooms generally, they're an hour and 45 minutes. I know some teachers have only 50 minutes to get something done. And I know that is really a challenge. I think specifically talking to a student, and sometimes I've had a situation where student, wanted to answer everything, and to really meet with that student and say, I know you know all the answers, or I know you really want to speak to everything. And it's really a matter of participating in this classroom community, letting others answer. I know you know, but let's see what, if somebody else knows as well. And sometimes it requires a cue, hopefully nonverbal, because, that's better. I've gone over to, first of all, I've had sometimes students sit near to where I am standing, or I walk around the classroom a lot. And I'll just tap on their desk and they know, it's just like a little cue, like, I'll get to you. I really want to hear your responses, but maybe not all of them. And then I have asked the student to write down all of the questions, and then maybe I'll make space. So there's all sorts of, I'm sure there's a lot of ways of doing this. I also want to address students who need to move. And I know that some students have been told to leave the classroom, and that really bothers me, because they're missing out. So I have, and there's a fine line between disruptive movement and just movement they have to do. So sometimes I had a student go to the back of a classroom and pace. And after a while, that student felt comfortable enough to stop pacing after week 3. So that was really great. And some students won't, but you know, that I felt like it was not disruptive, and I felt like that allowed that student to become interested in what was going on and sit down and, or maybe from standing, participate. The other thing I wanted to tell educators at the college level is that whatever behavior or whatever you're experiencing with a student, it's probable that another teacher or multiple teachers in high school has already experienced that. I've had so many students say, oh yeah, my high school teacher told me to hold all my questions. And this is like a reminder to them, you've already learned the skills. Hey, you could use them in my classroom. Yeah,
I appreciate that, because I think it also speaks back to flexibility. And when we talk about access, and I'm going to tap Kirsten next, of course, because we're going to talk about universal design, which has been mentioned already. Those of you not familiar with this concept, certainly the panelists are, but some of our audience may be, you know, I always equate it to architectural access. You know, when you think about the ramp into the building for somebody who has a mobility challenge, so that's an architectural access, but similarly, educational access is the ramp into the classroom so that everybody has access to education. And there's a lot of principles behind this, and Kirsten's written a book about it. But I guess what I want to ask Kirsten to talk a little bit about is, what are some of the most effective ways that you've seen faculty design their curriculum and design their teaching that has effective means of representation, expression, and engagement to promote the access? Are there any tips that you would share in a short period of time?
Just a bit, huh? Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot that we can do. And I think universal design is a really, for many, it's like the aha moment that they come across, like, oh yeah, that's why, you know, it's interesting. I also use closed captioning. That's helpful to me to process information. But it can also feel a little overwhelming to faculty. You know, do I have to redesign my whole course, or what does that look like? And we've even taken it a little bit into sort of the student services and how we interact with students, engage with them. I think the thing that I would push more than anything is our +1 strategy. So find the area of the class that if you've taught the class before and you've looked out at your students and they're all sort of glazed over, or they're all fidgeting or looking at their phones, and that might be the area that you add one more strategy. So for instruction, for example, today's students have an attention span of about 8 seconds. We equate it to a squirrel. Oh my gosh, look, there's a new nut. And so what we want to do is think about the fact that we can't lecture to a class for 45 minutes and expect all of the students to stay engaged the entire time. Rather, what if we stopped it every few minutes and asked the students to share as they're comfortable, or to you know, use other resources like guest lectures or activities or those types of things. I think, you know, there are a lot of things that we can do now that we're sort of digital as well as in person, in terms of making sure the content that we are using in our classes is also available in a digital format. Once content's available in a digital format, students can do what they wish with it. They can listen to it. Many of our students are traveling or back and forth from home, or they're just better auditory learners, so they can download it to a file and listen to it as they go. They can blow it up to larger font if they like. They can manipulate it, and highlight it, and rearrange things and reorganize things. And these are strategies that some will come into college with, and others might work with a learning center or their accommodation specialist to identify things that are specific to their learning needs. So I think that's probably the easiest thing. From an accommodation standpoint, and I put my disability hat on here, one of the things that I think all of our disability colleagues would love professors to do, and Susan, correct me if I'm wrong, is consider a universal note taker. So many of our students are asking for notes or copies of notes, and we are noticing a bit of an increase in ask that first semester, first year at college. And I think a lot of that is a bit of anxiety around, what does a college class look like? How am I going to keep up? This is going to be really fast. This is new to me. So there's a bit of a, concern there. Whereas in the spring semester, the requests always go down. But there are many reasons that a student can't keep notes and can't keep up with the notes in a class. perhaps they're navigating something at home that's on their mind, or they're easily distracted, or they need to miss a class for a particular reason. And so we've seen a great deal of impact where faculty have randomly assigned 1 or 2 folks to take notes every class, and then those notes are posted up to the course website. What's great about that is then students can interact with those notes in a way that works for them at a later point in time. And the biggest question I always get from faculty when we talk about this is, yeah, but does that mean students aren't going to come? The answer is no. They will still come, they will still listen, but actually what you'll find is that they're more attentive because they're less worried about writing every word down and more comfortable knowing that they have something they can refer back to later on. So it actually increases the engagement in the class, which is a really great strategy.
Which I have found that as well. And again, the past year and a half has created an opportunity because people that had not traditionally taught online all of a sudden are teaching online. And I've always said to faculty, you don't make their notes a secret. You know, post them on the LMS, whatever LMS you're using, so that everybody has access. Madhi, you have a question.
Not a question, but I just wanted to add that because we have these videos ready now, so we can post them beforehand, and we can do, like, I teach physics and I do a lot of problems in my class. So giving them worksheets, and I actually, when I was teaching at Merrimack College, they have white walls where they can write, and students get up and write. So this is what I do. I have those post-it big notes. I put them on the cupboard, those lab equipment cupboards, and I ask them to get up and work in groups, and so that I can see their solution from a distance. Occasionally they peek into their neighbor. Occasionally they peek into their neighbor's work, and that's okay. They're learning either way. So yes. we can make them get up from their seats now. Now that the lecture is online, they can view it beforehand. They can come for doing problems and then the lab work.
Right. So one of the questions or the challenges that I've heard from faculty, and again, I'm going to tap Margie for this first time, is about assessment. Ways to assess and measure a student's mastery and achievement within a sort of a construct of universal design. Anything that you found effective in terms of figuring out, does the student get it?
That's a great question, Susan. I think over the years, I've moved my assessment all over the place. I actually wanted to go back to talking about something. I think group work has come up, and I think sometimes that's used as assessment. Especially about 10, 15 years ago, there was a very big push on group work and assessed group work. And I'm going to say that I use group work, I use work in pairs, but I don't use it for assessment. I find it has a lot of difficulties and challenges for the students, it's just really rife. I think the original thing was that if you work in a work group, but the 15 weeks in a classroom is, for me, not accessible group work. I love group work, they do it. As a matter of fact, the first day of class, pairs of students are assigned by me to 2 pairs, and they introduce each other. That allows them to do some structured social interaction, which is a big feature of group work. But I know this is a question about assessment, but I really wanted to put that plug in there because I do assess very much with exams. I assess with, I teach computer science, and I also assess with quizzes. I assess with something called MyLab programming. A lot of the areas have MyLabs associated, which is like drilling questions where they can keep answering a question until they get it right. I do give assessment points for that because it doesn't matter to me that they're referring to the textbook. It gets them to refer to the textbook. For some students, I find that teaches a student how to read a textbook that maybe the student did not have the ability to really figure out, well, where do I start? Especially a textbook in STEM, where it's not just text, it's examples. I also wanted to say that computer science, this is a shameless plug for computer science. Computer science happens to be an area where a lot of the strengths of some of the students on the autism spectrum, like persistence, ability to hyperfocus, ability to think logically versus emotionally. Sometimes the really sheer literalness that some students have are actually all a great asset. This makes them able to create these amazing computer programs that they're writing in my classroom, which I do assess with the product that, can you write a computer program? So, yeah.
That's very helpful. And so I just want to ask Kirsten, is there anything that you've seen in your, especially at Tufts, where I know that you have pretty significant STEM programs, faculty being effective in terms of assessment that incorporates universal design principles?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest things that we've seen and we've encouraged faculty to think about is the actual learning objectives of the course. So we want to design an assessment to get to figure out whether students learned what we asked them to learn, not to evaluate whether or not they're good at a multiple choice exam or a paper or a program or whatever they're doing. I think, offering a bit of variety in how students are assessed throughout the semester is one strategy, right? So it's not just 2 exams. That's the other thing, leaning everything on 2 exams is just, I'm a faculty, so I feel like I can say this, it's cruel. And we want, students to be able to show their knowledge gains as they go instead of like putting all that pressure on those 2 experiences. So it's a combination of offering flexibility in how we assess, really driving back to those learning objectives and figuring out, I need them to understand, for example, the molecular structure of a cell. Does that have to be done in a multiple choice exam, or are there other options for allowing students to do it? I will say that I've had a chemistry professor here who, was very much into that final exam and that midterm exam process until COVID, and realized that the proctoring process in COVID online was more than they wanted to deal with. So what they did was started to allow students to do projects. And they gave some loose sort of guidelines in a rubric around what they needed in the project. But the reward for the faculty member in seeing all the different ways students expressed what they had learned, and then being able to share those projects with fellow students was really wonderful, because students could engage with the content in a way that worked well for them. I also want to echo what Professor Bleichman said about group work. What we tend to do in that space, because this can be difficult for students, any student, but particularly students on the autism spectrum, is if it's required or if it really meets that learning objective, we ask the faculty think about what the different roles within a group could be. Does everybody have to stand up in front of the class and present? Or can somebody be, sort of the researcher or the presenter putter together, or those types of things, to offer that flexibility and the ability to be somewhat anonymous behind the scenes as desired.
And so I appreciate that, because I did a lot of work with students about preparing for careers. And, most of us know that that's actually how it would happen in an office situation. I also wanted to comment on sort of one of the silver linings of the COVID time and the COVID life has been some changes in pedagogy, and I'm so going to refer now to both Eric and Peter to talk a little bit about the role of technology. And certainly the college community has experienced the benefits of access through technology, and we don't know it any better than we do in the past 15 months. Eric, how do you see technology to be a tool to support the success of students on the spectrum?
Well, there's really so many ways. It's hard to know where to begin. I think Kirsten was talking about the silver linings with the pandemic, and what I've seen with students is sort of a bimodal distribution, where some students have really struggled with remote learning and other students have really thrived. And I certainly hope going forward that we have more diversity of options for students, just like in the workplace, working remotely, that students who do thrive with remote learning can have that option. Certainly, with all the technologies that Kirsten was talking about in terms of providing notes, recorded lectures, what have you, that can be really useful for students who might be distracted in the classroom. And then there's so many apps for executive functioning. again, it's such a long list of potential ways technology can be helpful. It would take a while to cover all of them.
Right, and I know that we're time limited, but I know that this is a passion of Peter's, so I want to give Peter a chance to talk a little bit about technology tools, support that you've seen that have been successful, both before COVID and during COVID.
Well, I certainly do think that COVID was very good to the online community. Across higher education, we had large cohorts of faculty who refused to explore online as a teaching modality, and suddenly they weren't given much of a choice. And now they've begun to realize that yes, you can teach and learn in this environment. And that's beneficial to a wide variety of students, but particularly students, I think, who are neurodiverse or on the spectrum, because they've always needed a variety of modalities. A friend of mine, Clark Aldridge, who is an expert on education, said that one of the problems of American education is that we have a model that is very, very good for a certain type of person. But if you're not that certain type of person, it's not a very good model. And I think there is a greater appreciation now that there are many paths to an effective learning experience. And I think too, the other thing that we should focus on is that COVID forced the students themselves to be more proactive, both the neurotypical and the neuroatypical. And so they realized that the learning requires more of their own agency. And I think this is again an experience that many of them wouldn't have gone through or wouldn't have attempted if it hadn't been for COVID. And now I think they're coming out of it with a greater degree of confidence. And I think that's one of the great things. As for technology, I think there are so many apps available now that weren't available 5 years ago. And I particularly think that the educational technology developments in regards to artificial intelligence offer tremendous promise in terms of creating AI assistance for students who need a little guide on the side to help nudge them at the right moment. And I think there are probably a number of companies that are exploring that possibility, not only for neurodiverse students, but for neurodiverse adults as well who are in post-secondary experience.
Which is, I'm very excited about that. And so when we think about this broader discussion of UDL, many people see this as an opportunity to level the playing field for many diverse students. And so there's this whole notion of accommodations-free classroom. So again, I'm going to tap Kirsten in thinking about or aiming for an accommodations-free classroom. What may be useful? How might this be achieved? And what information might or resources might faculty or college communities need to meet that goal?
It's a goal that I truly love, and I hope someday will put me out of a job. I can say that comfortably. But I want to be careful in saying that we would be accommodations free, because I do think that there are certain students that will always need accommodations that are above and beyond some of the universal design for learning strategy that we can provide. I think institutions, more so than individual faculties, need to commit resources and time and training for faculty and for staff around things like captioning, accessible course content, how to design that, how to create that, how to offer that, all of these amazing apps that are being suggested. So I think institutions need to adopt the UDL approach and filter it down a bit. We have great success with individual faculty, and the faculty here are sharing wonderful examples of things that they're doing, but unfortunately that's not always across the board. And so a student might be incredibly successful in one class and they hit a number of barriers in a second class. And so I think a combination of faculty engagement and education, as well as institutional support for that learning, is really, really ideal.
And so Eric, I want to get your 2 cents on this. What are your thoughts?
On being accommodations free?
Yeah. How do we move that way? Is that the way to go?
Well, I think all the conversation we've had about universal design does move in that direction. I don't know if there may, as Kirsten said, always be some need for additional services and supports for some students and accommodations. but it's a great direction to move in on an institutional level.
Okay, and so sort of dovetailing with that is the notion of interdependence, which is loosely defined as the quality or condition of being interdependent, not a great definition there, or mutually reliant on each other. And it's synonymous with relationships and connection and confidence. Peter, do you have any thoughts about the notion of interdependence in the classroom and how this might influence pedagogy and teaching strategies to support students on the autism spectrum, and for that matter, for all students? Any
yes,
thoughts?
you know, going back to what Margie said about the emphasis on team-based learning a few years ago, you know, team-based learning in many ways is a challenge to the traditional paradigm of education, where a lot of students are encouraged to be lone wolves, to study by themselves, to get their individual grade. And that projects a certain overall mentality. And early in my career, when I was working at a university, I noticed how students from other cultures, particularly Eastern Asia, would make a regular emphasis of working and studying together, which to me was a real surprise. I had never really seen those large clusters of people studying together. And I realized, again, our educational paradigm has been influenced by our culture in some ways that are not entirely positive. You know, a classroom should reflect a society in the sense that we're not just individual people, but we are mutually dependent upon one another. And we all succeed when we all work together, not just for our own academic achievement in the class, but for our overall achievement. And I think not only pedagogically is that a better model for everyone, I think it is socially a better model for us in general.
Okay, so before we move to our final questions, I want to ask Madhu and Margie if they have any thoughts that emerge about interdependence. And I see, Margie, you have your hand up, so I'm going to hit you first.
Thank you. I think creating a classroom community, and it's harder in virtual classrooms than it is in the actual classroom, but creating a classroom community where all students are really invested in each other. And I've seen this happen where all the students, I don't want to say they get protective of each other, they get very caring of each other, regardless of if they're on an autism spectrum or not. And the teamwork that I do, and I said I don't try to assess that, but there's a lot of teamwork, and sometimes it's at the micro level of let's build an answer to this question together. And somebody gives one answer, part, and I go, okay, let's build on that. And then somebody does another. And then even if the person, gave a very small part of the answer, they've together built the, a correct answer. I look for that. The other thing is that they do these, I call them whole body movement exercises, and the whole class gets up. In one of the courses, I say, we're studying sorts, how you can arrange yourselves in different ways. And this gets, people get a little silly, it's okay, because in the end, by using their bodies to learn this, everybody is learning this. I had a student I talked to 10, 15 years later who said, the only thing I remembered from your data structures course was when you made us sort ourselves with the merge sort. I mean, it was just, I was glad he remembered something, And again, this is another accommodations free thing, because those are not that's not specifically for students on the spectrum, but it really, I think, helps everybody to do this. It's this body memory, and they really are learning it. So I wanted to put a plug in for that.
That's great. Madhu, I know you have some thoughts on this as well.
Because we have lab sections, and that's the best time when I enjoy with the students, and the students enjoy each other's company. So I miss that most in the COVID time, because at that time when they are in the group, there is nobody knows there is autism or ADHD. They are together there. That's the beautiful component of labs. And I totally missed that. During the COVID in Zoom sessions also, when I put them in the meeting groups, there were some groups that were excellent, chatty, and there were some groups that were totally silent. But they have no choice when they are in person. So they have to communicate. So that's why in STEM, in labs, the virtual labs didn't work that well. So looking forward to opening up the lab in person. Apart from this, I have one last thing that constantly bothered me, that we always talk about accommodations from academic perspective. What about the emotional and the social needs? Like, are there certain groups where they can go and talk freely? How are we building that community for them? Like, all these accommodations always talk about extra time, note taking. What about a club where they can just talk about their difficulties, so that they feel they're not the only ones? There are so many of them with similar problems.
And that's a great suggestion. And what's reassuring is I think that is emerging. Sometimes it emerges naturally, sometimes it's orchestrated, but there are opportunities, and I think that that's growing, especially with self-advocacy. And I think that that's an important. So this sort of wraps up the bigger question as the college and university community looks for ways to support diversity, including support to students with autism. We're looking to you all, your expertise. So to that end, I'd like to ask each of you to share your recommendations, your final recommendations or thoughts that you may have on how higher education in general can create and support a more inclusive environment for students on the autism spectrum, which ultimately is a more inclusive environment for all students. So I'm going to go in the order that I see you. So I'm going to ask Margie first, and then I'll go around the room. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Susan. Well, I think that organize. If a teacher is organized with their information, they're gonna give that information to the student. They're going to model being organized. And also it's helpful in so many ways. I actually use Blackboard, which is our learning management system. I use Blackboard extensively, even in my fully not online, fully in classroom, whenever we get into the classroom classes. I put everything out there. In particular, I use Blackboard announcements every week. They're expecting it from me. This is what we're doing this coming week. These are the deliverables. There's going to be a test. There's going to be a homework assignment. This is when just everything is there. And I color code it and bold it. And I have found students actually tell me, I love your color coding, which sounds like such a tiny thing. I'm not focusing on that. I'm just saying that if you can organize the information, make their expectations every week really organized as well, then everybody benefits. So
I love that. I love that. Eric, any thoughts on, and I know, again, you and I have talked about this in other venues. Yeah. What colleges and universities could and should be doing? So
first of all, if you care about diversity, if you're committed to diversity, then understand that neurodiversity and diversity of abilities is part of diversity. So, so true diversity means including students on the spectrum, students with other learning differences, students with other disabilities. And secondly, understand that when you put all of them together, not just autistic students, but students with other learning differences, you're talking about a lot of students, and these students traditionally don't have high retention rates. They don't have high graduation rates. So you're losing out on a lot of income and a lot of intellectual capital going into the workforce. So if you can address their needs successfully, you will retain more tuition money, you'll improve your statistics, and you'll help society as a whole.
Excellent. Peter, your 2 cents?
Well, I'd like to echo what Eric said, that it would make much more sense if right now, as colleges are building their model of diversity, they include neurodiversity now, rather than trying to shoehorn it in 5 or 10 years from now, when it'll be much more problematic. And again, along with these diversity initiatives is coming a lot of funding, and I'd like to see that funding start flowing towards the neurodiverse efforts sooner rather than later, because as Eric pointed out, there's enormous capital, intellectual capital being lost when these students aren't nurtured. And as colleges become more conscious of their duty preparing their students, all their students, to transitions from a purely academic world to a workplace, I want them to be aware that responsibility includes their neurodiverse students as well. So whatever guided pathway that they devise for their students, they have to realize they have to devise guided pathways for, you know, a diverse body of students, including the neurodiverse.
That's hear, hear. Madhu, do you have any thoughts on this overarching theme?
Yes, I want to get trained. So training the campus community, faculty training specifically, that can also incorporate the benefits of strong pedagogical methodology and very effective tools given to faculty to handle these scenarios. Like training should focus on assisting faculty in understanding the importance of direct communication, including the use of language in the syllabus, correct language, and clear feedback to the students on assessments. So I'm a work in progress in that department because I'm just learning. I had a recent experience with a friend of mine who's a very bright student got dropped off the college because of a newly found ADHD problem. So the college and the disability service had no communication going on, and the student was all through working with the disability service, but the drop happened from the registrar. The student is running in a lot of nervous tantrums now. So I think the college should have connection with the registrar and the disabilities together. What is going on with each student,
Right?
Because they are their responsibility.
And as a former administrator, similar to what Kirsten's role is, communication is key. So I'm sure, Kirsten, you have a lot to say on this. I'm going to give you about 2 minutes.
Okay, I'll try to be succinct. I think the biggest point I'd want to follow up on is Eric's. We look very much as disability as diversity. And as institutions of higher ed are re-examining or rethinking how they're approaching diversity right now with everything that's happening in the world, I think this is an ideal time for disability service directors and others to make sure that the disability, the neurodiversity, all of these components are included in those conversations, because most of our students have many identities. It's not just this one specifically. I think they can do that by making sure that the language is throughout the institution is inclusive and also consistent. So it needs to be inclusive on the website, the admissions materials, the course content, the syllabi content, all the way through. The other thing I think is important for institutions to think about is that while the academic experience is clearly important, it's not the only experience that these students are going to be having in college. This is a transformative time for our students. So we need to think about things like student clubs and the dining hall. Is that a welcoming experience? And the residence life, if such a thing exists at that institution. And to that point, and to Madhu's point, a lot of times institutions of higher ed, this might be shocking, are somewhat siloed. Every office tends to work in its own little bubble, and we, while we pride ourselves on connecting students to each office, offices themselves may not share that communication. And students, like Madhu's example, do slip through the cracks. So I think institutions of higher ed can do a better job communicating in an efficient and effective way to catch students before they fall and try to offer supports for students sort of with that diversity lens on it moving forward. Last thing I swear is I really want to make sure that students with diverse backgrounds, diverse learning needs are included on things like hiring committees, student panels, student committees, student groups, all of these things, so that voices are heard everywhere and not just in the disability office or in the classroom. I think it's really important that these voices are heard more broadly.
That's an excellent point. And we could talk for hours, but we don't have them. So I just want to again thank the panelists and the Stairway to STEM community for your commitment to this valued and important conversation. And I ask you to please look for more information about this on the Stairway to STEM website, on the Stairway to STEM Foundation launch, and our social network. And I thank all of you for your generosity, your collaboration, and the valuable insight that you gave to this whole conversation and this panel. So take good care, be well, and again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan.
Thanks, Susan.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a
Bye.
pleasure.